In the story of how American railroading went from this to this, there is one train that deserves more than just a footnote in this monumental story. The Capital Limited. Although it's now just a shadow of its former self, this one Amtrak train embodies the history of American railroading like no other. Taking its name from the once flagship train of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the Capital now travels daily between Washington, D.C. and Chicago, Illinois. To look at the history of this one train and its predecessor railroad, the B&O, is to look at the history of U.S. railroading in its entirety. From the laying of the first rails, to the golden age of rail travel, its decline in the mid-20th century, and the resurgence of rail travel today, the B&O and its legacy were there through it all. And one tragic day in Capital Limited history has led to changes in railroading operation procedure that are still in place today. To know this train and its history is to know the big picture of all of U.S. passenger railroading. In its heyday, the Capital Limited quickly earned a reputation for its unparalleled luxury and impeccable service. From its opulent Pullman cars to its gourmet dining experiences, the train epitomized the height of sophistication and elegance, attracting travelers from all walks of life. The premier train of the B&O first took to the rails in 1923. But the B&O put some of the first trains as we know them today on American rails almost a century before this. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was chartered in 1827. The B&O was the first common carrier of freight and passengers in the U.S., created to compete with the dominance of the newly opened Erie Canal across New York State. The line began in Baltimore and forged its way westward to bring goods and passengers from the port of Baltimore to what was then the western frontier. Its ultimate destination was to be the Ohio River, hence the name Baltimore and Ohio. Although tracks didn't reach that goal until 1852, its first major milestone was achieved when the line reached Ellicott's Mills in what is now Ellicott City, Maryland. Back in 1830, the first trains to travel the 13 miles from Baltimore to Ellicott's Mills were pulled by horse. Although the B&O didn't operate the first steam-powered trains in the country, they were the first railroad to use an American-built locomotive as opposed to other companies who imported their engines from England at the time. The brand new technology had definitely not come into its own yet, and the steam trains actually made the trip to Ellicott's Mills 10 minutes slower than the horse-drawn ones. The first American-built steam engine, the Tom Thumb, was the star of one of the most hotly debated stories in railroad history. As the tale goes, the Tom Thumb was on one of its runs between Baltimore and Ellicott's Mills when it came upon one of the railroad's trains still hauled by horse. The race that allegedly ensued between the horse-drawn train and the Tom Thumb is now the stuff of legends. The Tom Thumb was rumored to have broken down, allowing the horse to win the battle, but the dominance of steam power was a foregone conclusion. Over the ensuing decades, the B&O continued to innovate and expand its network. By the mid-19th century, the B&O had become a vital artery of commerce and transportation, playing a pivotal role in shaping the economic and social landscape of the United States. But during their early years, train journeys were nothing like they are today. They were often arduous and fraught with danger as railroads pushed westward into the unknown. But certainly by the beginning of the 20th century, the golden era of rail journeys had begun, and the fierce competition to lure passengers with the highest speed and the finest luxuries was in full swing. The B&O first introduced the Capital Limited in 1923. Today's Amtrak Capital Limited travels daily between Washington and Chicago. But back in the days of the B&O, the Capital Limited's original route took passengers all the way from New York City to Chicago by way of Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. After passengers boarded buses from throughout Manhattan, they were then taken to New Jersey by ferry. The B&O train departed the Communipaw Terminal in Jersey City for Washington, D.C. and Chicago. Steam gave way to diesel in 1938 when the B&O purchased brand new EA and EB units from Electromotive. One of the EA units that was in service on the Capital Limited has been restored and is now on display at the B&O Railroad Museum in downtown Baltimore. The Capital Limited ruled the rails of the East during the height of overnight passenger train travel in the early and mid-20th century. But as car and airplane travel began taking market share from these illustrious trains, America's railroads were eager to get out of the business of carrying passengers. In 1971, Amtrack was created to take these money-losing services off the plates of the struggling rail companies. While many of the famous American trains would be carried on by Amtrack, the Capital Limited would not be among them. Here we see one of the last regular westbound runs of the Capital Limited as it arrives into Silver Spring, Maryland in September of 1969. Here another westbound arrives into Silver Spring, this time only days before the start of Amtrack. Even though the Capital would soon be discontinued, the B&O had no intentions of going out with a whimper. And in April of 1971, just days before the beginning of Amtrack, the Baltimore and Ohio decided to honor the legacy of their proud flagship with one final commemorative run. For the special round trip, the best of the best equipment was selected from their entire system in order to run this one last iteration of the B&O Capital. By 1958, the route had been truncated to run only between Baltimore and Chicago. It was pared back once again in 1966 to now only run between Washington, D.C. and Chicago, with a Bud RDC providing the connection between Baltimore and Washington. But for the commemorative Capital, the train would originate and terminate in Baltimore's Camden Station. Here we see the commemorative train on its final leg as it approaches the last stop in Baltimore. The very next day, the Capital Limited would ride the rails no longer. After May 1st of 1971, the route of the Capital Limited would go largely unserved for the next decade. But in October of 1981, Amtrak would revive the Washington to Chicago service with their iteration of the Capital. From Washington, Amtrak's Capital follows much of the original route to Pittsburgh. From there, the train abandons the old B&O right-of-way and travels over trackage originally owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad to Cleveland. Cleveland was not served by the original B&O Capital. From Cleveland, it then follows the route of the old New York Central Railroad to Chicago, a route that is now shared with Amtrak's Lakeshore Limited. The Amtrak Capital has soldiered on, running pretty much continuously since 1981. At first, it was equipped with single-level heritage cars. The Capital was later re-equipped to superliners in 1994. Unfortunately, only 2 years later, the Capital would be involved in an accident that would lead to the creation of a new railroading rule known as delay and block. On February 16, 1996, the westbound Capital Limited departed Washington Union Station bound for Chicago as usual at 5:25 p.m. As it approached Georgetown Junction in Silver Spring, Maryland, dispatchers aligned the route for the Capital to switch over from Track 2 to Track 1. Also on Track 2 heading in the opposite direction was an eastbound MARC commuter train. It passed a yellow approach signal just prior to its station stop in Kensington, Maryland. The yellow approach indicated that the MARC train should be prepared to stop at the next signal, where the Capital was about to cross over and leave Track 2 open for the MARC train to continue. However, when leaving the station in Kensington, the operator of the MARC train forgot that they had just passed an approach signal and accelerated out of the station at full throttle. By the time the MARC crew saw the red signal and the Capital Limited heading straight towards them on the same track, it was too late. Once the Amtrak engineer realized what was happening, they very smartly accelerated the Capital so that it would reach the crossover before the MARC train, thus avoiding a head-on collision. The Capital had already begun taking the crossover when the MARC train's cab car slammed into the side of the Amtrak engine. This accident directly resulted in the implementation of delay and block for trains without cab signaling. If a train stops within a block, then the operator must assume that the next signal will be red until the indication is clearly visible. This is due to the fact that conditions may have changed while the train was stopped within the block. Delay and block is still in place in many sections of railroad, as is indicated with signs just like these. The early 2000s would be smooth sailing for the capital, with high ridership and plenty of revenue from Amtrak's then booming mail and express business. The COVID pandemic would briefly reduce the capital's schedule to only run a few days per week instead of daily, and would see its lounge car and dining car replaced with only a single cafe car. The train is still running with this bare-bones consist today, despite its continually increasing popularity in recent years. It seems the next chapter of the Capital Limited story has yet to be written. And with Amtrak putting out a request for proposal to procure new long-distance trains, plus their considerations for many national network changes, it remains to be seen what the future will hold for this storied American train. Please like and subscribe, or give a super thanks to support the channel. To learn more about another one of Amtrak's routes, check out this video next about the Southwest Chief. Thank you for watching Rail Weekly.